Welcome to The Score, where we break down what's really working in hiring, separate the science from the fluff, and hear from the experts shaping the future of talent assessment.
I'm Nicola Tatham, Chief IO Psychologist. I help organisations put the right people into the right roles with skills assessments that are scientifically valid, reliable and fair.
And I'm Caroline Fry, Head of Product at Sova. I build the bridge between assessment science and hiring reality, making it work for recruiters and candidates.
At each episode, we bring in a guest with talent assessment expertise to help us tackle the big challenges in hiring.
Because when it comes to talent, science-backed decisions aren't optional.
Today, we're joined by Emily Williams. She's Sova's Customer Success Director. So Emily leads the team here, the team that makes sure that talent assessment solutions go beyond implementation and actually drive value for clients and candidates alike. So Emily's seen it all: global rollouts, tricky timelines, stakeholder wrangling, and today she's here to share what makes delivery really work, what real partnerships look like, and why customer success is a lot more strategic than people think. So hi, Emily.
Hi.
Good to have you with us. Right, it's good to see you. So Caroline, I'll let you ask the first question.
Thank you. Hi, Emily. Welcome. We're going to start with something light and easy to break us in. What's the most unexpected question you've ever been asked during an interview?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think so. I have never had any of the questions that people tend to get. You know, like what ice cream flavor would you be if you were any that sort of thing. I've never had anything super unusual. But I think when I was at uni, I applied for a youth working role at our local community centre, and one of the things that they asked us to do is they gave us a series of monsters that represented different emotions, and they asked us to think about how we would kind of turn that into some kind of exercise or a game that you would do with teenagers. And I think that was quite an not something I was expecting at all, and also quite an interesting thing because I was a teenager myself, trying to figure out how you would turn that into some kind of interesting game that other teenagers will want to do, which obviously most wouldn't. So that was an interesting experience. But yeah, I've never had any of the kind of some of the things that you hear about where you've been asked a really strange question that is kind of, completely out of the blue.
Yeah, that does kind of make some sense, I guess, for the role that you were actually applying for. Yeah, interesting. So, I think sort of moving on to some questions that are slightly more relevant to the role that you're in at the moment. Let's start with, I guess, quite a big question, but what does great customer success actually look like in our space, in the assessment space? And how is that different from just sort of supporting the technology?
It's a great question. I think customer success is so multifaceted. There's so many different parts that a customer success team plays in client relationships. And I think, well, one of those things, as I just mentioned, is relationships. I think building a really, really great foundational relationship with clients and really, really understanding what it is that they are aiming to achieve really, really helps to sort of unpick the direction that we're heading in. I think that the tech is one part of that, and making sure that there's a real great understanding of what the solution is and what it's bringing for the organization is really, really key. But it's also looking at the different groups of individuals that are using that technology and thinking about how each of their different goals align to that kind of general direction of travel that we're heading in. And I think there's the initial sort of initial relationship building that's really, really key when you're looking to actually implement something for the first time, but it doesn't stop there. And it's making sure that we're looking at that whole 360 view of what it is that we're aiming to achieve and all the different ways in which we could look to tackle that. So yeah, there's a huge amount within that, but I think the cornerstone is really that kind of great, strong relationship, building really strong trust and making sure that we're all heading in the same direction, heading towards that same goal set.
So how do you define success beyond just getting something live? I mean, getting something live is, one element of success in its own right, but how do you define success beyond that, especially when you've got every client's goal is different, but even within a client, you've got different stakeholders that define success differently.
I think every client will have a different goal, and within that, you'll obviously have different stakeholders that have different goals. I think I mentioned there about kind of getting to the why. I think that is the most critical thing, because if you're really unpicking and uncovering why we're doing something, that is the kind of the main driving factor in then being able to ensure that you're delivering on what it is that you're all aiming to achieve ultimately. And I think the initial kind of go live of something is what everyone tends to kind of focus on. That's what everyone's kind of initial goal is. But then it's thinking about things like, how often is that being used across different business areas or markets? Do we have some areas that we need to spend a bit more time uncovering, what the blockers are for them being able to use a new solution, or thinking about different ways that we might be able to engage with them? It's thinking about the way that things have been built. So sometimes when you have that initial go live planned, things are built in a very specific way, particularly if it's a new customer who's perhaps not, familiar with our solutions, who then, we've built something, and actually there's kind of the iteration of that then happens when a bit of time using the platform and using assessments and figuring out kind of what works for them. Is there a way that we can enhance this and make this even better than what we've already currently got? And some of the different things that we can look to do, learning from the data and things that we have from the first go live, and really helping to sort of shape what that looks like moving forward. So I think it's never resting, never kind of sitting still, and really proactively trying to drive some of those different outcomes with that kind of ultimate goal in mind, but thinking about different ways that you can achieve that and being quite creative with it.
Mm. I'm thinking more widely about your experience at Sova and also previously in CS. Like, can you share a moment from a client partnership that really stuck with you, and maybe something that changed your approach to how you work?
That's an interesting question, actually. I think so I at Sova, I first joined in the professional services team, and then I had a bit of time out on maternity leave and came back into customer success. And what's been quite interesting for me is there's been a number of moments that are very similar in that, where I had worked with customers in my previous role, and we were talking about, what it was they were looking to achieve, and sort of how we were planning to deliver on that. And then obviously taking a little bit of time away and come back into those conversations. What I found really interesting is that the goals that we're talking about are largely the same. So there are some variations in that, particularly if we've got new stakeholders that we're working with. But broadly, the goals that we're aiming to achieve are, still the same as they were, months or perhaps even years previously. And I think that the really interesting thing for me is that oftentimes it's always sort of driving forwards towards that goal, and there's not so much reflecting back on actually what has the journey been so far, what great things have we already done that are kind of slowly bringing us towards that ultimate goal. And I think that's really important, because it's making sure that recognizing that sometimes it's not a sort of tick box of, this is where we're aiming to get. We do these three things, and ultimately we'll get there. It might be that goal might seem quite far out of reach, or, quite unattainable at times, because it's not something that you can kind of more immediately see results from. But actually there's some great work that happens in the meantime that does sort of slowly move the needle and get you slightly further towards that end goal that you're trying to reach. And it's sort of reflecting back on all those other things, the great things that have happened so far, and how much progress has been made as well, rather than, always kind of looking forwards and thinking about the next thing.
Yeah, I was going to ask how you sort of make that actionable in, even with your clients who might feel like they don't have the time to, spend time looking back, which is a good lesson for all of us, right? To see about
Uh-huh.
the progress that we've made and do those check-ins. It's the same with sort of development of individuals. So why not do that collectively with your sort of vendor partnerships or your supplier partnerships? Are
Mm,
clients, do they sort of respond to that? Are they open to considering where they've been and the journey they've taken with us?
yeah, I think obviously some more than others. It very much depends on kind of where they're at in their journey. It's a really good thing to do at those kind of milestone moments. So if it's,
Hmm.
the start of a new year, or something like that, where you're able to sort of sit down and reflect and have some more of those conversations, that you are sort of, yeah, more broadly looking at the way that you're doing things and how you want to do things moving forwards. And I think it's particularly nice when you're doing it in a setting with the broader teams who have actually delivered on some of this stuff, because they might still be hearing about, some of those goals that you're trying to reach, but not necessarily so much of the, what have we done so far, and what is the progress that's been made. So yeah,
Mm.
varies, but it's always a nice thing to do.
So, related to that, in your experience, what is it that you're most successful, however we're defining it, that your most successful clients do differently? What makes them sort of head and shoulders above the others? And we won't ask you to name any names.
I think one of the main things is consistency. And that's quite, I think, consistency in a number of different ways. I think consistency is really important for making sure that there's a solution in place that works for everyone. And I guess when we're kind of reflecting back on those goals and what we're ultimately trying to reach, if we've got a more consistent process in place across markets or across business areas or whatever that looks like within each business, it gives the opportunity to really use data to delve into specifically where things are working and where things perhaps could be done a little bit differently or enhanced somewhere. I think that really, really helps to drive a deeper understanding of what we can do to kind of really optimize things. I think it's a big journey. It's a huge change management piece for the business to go through to try and get that alignment and that consistency across processes. But it ultimately helps to really, yeah, dive into where they're at currently and how we can kind of further to move towards those goals. I think there are a huge number of clients that still do things in a more um, bespoke way for each of the different areas, and that works too. But where I've seen it work well at scale, there's definitely that sort of consistency, even if there's a slightly different journey for each of you on the way.
My next question, we talked about a sort of a lot of like the best examples of things going well, like theoretically in an ideal world, how things can work. Can you tell us about a time when something didn't go to plan from your perspective, but actually ended up being a better outcome in the end?
There's been many times where things haven't quite gone to plan. So lots of different times springing to mind. I think the one thing that I've found, and this is not necessarily again one specific time, it's happened a few times actually, where it relates to features in our platform and requests that clients have made for quite specific features, which Caroline, you'll be sympathetic to.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, some kind of specific things that they've asked for our platform to do. And that could be because they've used a different platform previously that has done that very specific thing, or just based on what they're trying to achieve, they've, thought about a slightly different way of doing things in our platform that might help them to get there. And I think sometimes we can do that, and that's great. We can do the feature request and it's quite a quick one for us to do, and you can kind of roll that out. Sometimes it's a yes, but not right now, and it's something that we do sort of later into the future. And I think that's always quite interesting because to them, it's then, I guess, in terms of the kind of overall timeline that we're working to, that could be perceived as something not quite going to plan because they were kind of hanging their hopes on this change in the platform. But actually, what that allows us to do, and it goes back to that piece around really unpicking the why of why is it that we need the platform to do that specific thing in that specific way? Is it because you've done that before and it's worked really well? Or what challenge are we trying to solve here? Where has this come from? And how can we really understand how we can then move this forwards for you? And it might be the feature, and that's great. We can kind of go ahead with that process, but it could be that actually there's a different way that we could look to use the platform, or a different process that we can put into place that does exactly what you need it to. And it's just a slightly more creative way of doing it than relying on the tech to do it instead. So that's always quite an interesting thing, because I think it does help to uncover what it is that we're trying to ultimately get to, rather than looking at the kind of platform solving something. There might be a longer term focus that can be put into place that really helps to maybe even eradicate the problem. Sometimes it's kind of just thinking creatively of different ways that we could do things that ultimately get to the same outcome without having to rely on the platform doing it.
So I guess sort of avoiding those knee-jerk reactions and
Mm,
stopping, pausing, reflecting. Why,
hmm
why do we need this? Is there an alternative route that you could get to more quickly rather
mm,
than waiting for a platform enhancement? And do you actually need to do it like this, or is it just that you've always done it this way?
yeah,
Is there a more innovative way that we could be working? Yeah, that makes sense.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Speaking for every product person ever, that is hugely appreciated. Um, I think we often find those, as Nick's rightly called them, the knee-jerk reactions are the features that then, get used once for an isolated time and then eventually just make a platform more complex. So that, you're basically doing a product process in those conversations for us, Emily, because, that finding that pain point and figuring out what's the right solution for resolving that. Might be technical, but it might be process. And that's why, especially for us, I think, because our platform is about people, like it, it's never clear cut every time that it would be a platform solution. So doing that analysis, which is what the product team would be doing once the feature request came in anyway, really helps. And I think it's really good for transparency with a client about why something may or may not be approved, and getting them thinking that way as well. So great job. Thanks.
So, what's one myth about rolling out assessments that you wish we could leave behind for good?
Oh, this is a good question as well. I One myth I think is that a shorter assessment automatically means great candidate experience. I think that there's a huge drive, especially in more recent years, to make sure that the assessment is as short as possible, because in doing that, candidates will have a better experience because they're not spending as long taking the assessment and sitting at their laptop. And that is true, and I think a shorter assessment may well mean in a lot of cases that candidates have a better experience, particularly if, there's a number of different components that we're looking to measure as part of that process. But then I think it's also thinking about candidate experience, not just in the way that they perceive their journey in the platform, what the steps that they're going through and what they think of that. It's also thinking about the broader context of what great candidate experience actually is. And fairness is a huge piece of that, because ultimately, if they're not having a fair experience, even if they're not aware of that at the time, then it will impact them ultimately and the outcomes of their journey. So it's that kind of trade-off of which, Nick,
Yeah.
you're always talking about. It's
Yeah.
yeah. Where can we find that balance of making sure that it is a great candidate experience, and as short as we can get it so that it is engaging for them, whilst also making sure that we don't lose some of the really vital parts of that assessment that we need to make sure that it's valid and fair. So
It's
yeah.
back to those pillars of what underlies good assessment, and its
Mm,
reliability, validity, its fairness.
mhm,
And I think it's probably in the last 10 years where candidate experience has, got an equal footing with those other three
mhm,
pillars.
mhm,
I think in the past, I remember designing assessments, like one psychometric test that would take over an hour to complete just for one, and people were asked to do a
mhm,
battery of them. But it's finding that sweet spot and finding that balance, and recognizing that, short is not always going to give you, the psychometric robustness that you want. That's not to say that we can't develop short assessments that do remain valid and robust, etc., etc. But it's just finding that sweet spot and not cutting corners, to the detriment of some of those underlying principles. So yeah, I completely agree with that, Emily.
I think like product and platform have a part of that too, because short doesn't necessarily equal good candidate experience, but the candidate experience taking the assessment, Nick and I were working on designing stuff right now
mhm,
that is engaging whilst you take it. And there you have a bit more flexibility with the length, as long as a candidate is experiencing something, engaging and enjoyable. We've all been there and clicked through very dry, stale tests and had a poor loading experience, and things haven't, particularly felt
mhm,
exciting, dare I say. And, gamified assessments have sort of had a bit of their day, and things have
mhm,
evolved. And I think there's more we can do there as well. So the only part of the sort of good doesn't equal short, it equals actually good and engaging.
mhm,
And that's, I think, both something that my team and Nick's team have to rise to the challenge when we're developing things, so that we can basically capture all elements, like get the data we need during the
mhm,
time that it takes to get it, but also not cause negative impacts on the candidates along the way. Slightly related to that, since we've talked
mhm.
about both of our business functions, product and IO, your team, as we all know, works very closely with many other business functions. So what's one thing, and you can be as open and frank with us as you like, we can take it. What's one thing you wish each of them better understood about your world in customer success?
I've got my notepads ready for
Yeah,
this.
me too.
Take notes. Customer success is quite interesting because I don't think it's very well understood universally. I think it looks a little bit different in every business, and I think increasingly there's a lot more great customer success knowledge sharing, as a function, there's a lot more about customer success out there that others can learn from. I think it is still very much a kind of unknown. And I think because it's so multifaceted in terms of what it is that customer success teams really focus on and deliver on, that can make it even more confusing. And I think that oftentimes the customer success team are the sort of they're the ones that wear all the hats, the ones, regardless of what the question is or the situation is, that the customer success team will always be the ones that can ultimately sort of support with that. So it does mean that they're kind of pulled in many different directions constantly. And I guess one thing that would be really useful for everyone to understand is that customer success is a team within the organization, but it is also uh, I'm hesitating to say mindset or an ethos, but it's something that every team across the business needs to do. There are ways that customer success is kind of threaded into what we all do every single day, regardless of the team that we're in. And I mentioned earlier about those internal relationships and the trust that we place in our colleagues across the business in delivering sort of parts of that journey in the amazing way that they do. And I think that is one thing, we wouldn't be successful at all if it weren't for the great support that we get from every single team across the business. It doesn't matter which team it is, everybody ultimately is supporting us to derive those great customer outcomes and all, driving towards those goals that I keep mentioning, which, are so important. And yeah, so I guess it's less about what we do in customer success. It's the contribution that everybody makes to that and how much we rely on those great relationships and all of the knowledge that everybody has internally. We're constantly reaching out to every single department in the business. So yeah, I think that's one thing that I think is probably not understood, and it'd be great if it was better understood across Sova.
I like it. So effectively, we're all one big customer success team.
Yeah,
Makes sense.
pretty much. Yeah.
Okay, so before we close the episode, Emily, we like to do a short game called Science or Fiction, where we'll throw out some statements and ask you to tell us which are good assessment advice and which are myth. So no pressure. The first one, science or fiction? Great onboarding guarantees great outcomes.
Science. I think onboarding is really critical.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, do I need to
I like
expand
it. You don't need to. Straight into the point. Let's carry on. Nick, are you going to ask the next one?
I will answer that one. I think, yeah, so great onboarding guarantees great outcomes. I think there's a nuance to that. You need great onboarding if you're going to get a great outcome, but I think that you need more than great onboarding to guarantee a great outcome. You need a great platform, you need a great team, you need great assessment. So I think I completely get where you're coming from in terms of it is size, but I think there's probably a missing word or two from that would make it a true sort of science. Definitely, yes.
Yeah.
You can't get a great outcome without a great onboarding experience,
Okay.
but you could have a great onboarding experience and still have a poor outcome.
Not get the outcome. Yeah, very
Okay,
true.
so we could flip it
Very true.
and say bad onboarding guarantees bad outcomes. That's probably more clear cut.
Yeah, that onboarding phase is kind of the foundation that you need to set you on the right path. And not, as I said, there are things that happen that you iterate from there, but you really need that to be set up for success right from the get-go. That is really, really critical. But yeah, I completely agree in it. There's a lot more to it than just that phase.
Which I guess means that you don't want to cut corners when it comes to onboarding, which takes me to my next statement, which is fast implementation means you have to cut corners. Science or fiction?
See, I would say fiction for this one, which I think obviously if you're doing something very quickly, you have to be able to prioritize and figure out what it is that you need to set you up for success quickly. And that might mean that you have to, change the scope of what you're doing ever so slightly. But I think that there's something being fast and being done in a more consistent way, or perhaps making great use of some of the off-the-shelf tools that we have available rather than looking to customize all the time, doesn't necessarily mean that the outcomes won't be as great. It's really thinking about what it is that we're trying to achieve here and how we can do that in the time that we have available. And that can sometimes mean that you do have to do things a little bit differently than you perhaps thought, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you won't see the results that you're hoping to ultimately.
So it's more about fast implementation. Doesn't mean you have to cut corners. Fast implementation means you have to think more innovatively about
Mhm.
how you're going to get there, perhaps creating more efficiencies and
Mm.
prioritizing key steps and kicking other things further down the line, but not doing that to the detriment of quality. Because I think cutting corners has got such a negative,
It does.
uh, tone to it, and that isn't something that we'd ever be encouraging people to do.
No.
It's getting to that place more quickly by using innovation, better processes, so on and so forth.
Mm. Mhm. Yeah, absolutely.
So you just sort of hinted at, you use the term off the shelf. So the flip
Mhm.
side to off the shelf is customization. So the
Mhm.
next statement is customization always makes the solution better. Science or fiction?
Fiction. I think customization can be great and it can absolutely be exactly what clients need in order to make sure that you know their solution is working the best for them, but it's not always it's not the only thing that ultimately leads to great outcomes. And I think, like I said before, it's really figuring out exactly what it is that we're trying to achieve, the time that we have available to achieve that, and based on those, then figuring out what the best route forward would be,
Mm.
and remembering that we don't always have to keep things exactly the same. There are opportunities to iterate and to develop
Yeah.
things further in the
Yeah.
future.
Because it depends what you mean by better, because we talked about always makes the solution better. But
Mhm.
if your success criteria is deliver by December and it's November,
Mm.
then your best solution is the one that's going to be off the shelf because it'll be
Mhm.
easier to get that live for the client.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we've got so much data that backs
Mhm.
up our off-the-shelf assessments, which we
Mhm.
may not have with some
Yeah.
customized. There's a lot of work that goes into validating those assessments and making sure we've got the data to know that they are going to be predictive of success in the role. So it's also thinking about, you know, what is the best route right now and what that might look like moving forwards. And a lot of the great solutions that I've seen clients implement have got a combination of both customized parts and off the shelf parts, and that works really, really well for them. So, yeah, again, getting under the skin of what they're looking to do is
Mm.
really important.
The next science or fiction, Emily, the statement is candidate experience is someone else's problem. Science or fiction?
Fiction. I think candidate experience is everyone's problem in a slightly different way. There might be different parts of that they're looking to focus on, but I think that everybody needs to have a focus on candidate experience because that's ultimately what makes the solution work really well. Obviously, there's other parts to it as well that also, you know, efficiency, for example, is another thing that kind of comes with that. But I think it's candidate experience sometimes is lost along the way, and that is a really, really critical thing. Thinking about how they would interact with the platform, what the different things are that they'll be, the different stages of the journey, what information you need to share with them. There are some clients that do that really, really, really well, and I think just whether there is that focus on it. So yeah, we always make sure that candidate experience is something we bring to the forefront.
The definite fiction answer to
Yeah.
that one. There's no grey in that.
No.
So our final one for Emily is you can't build a truly scalable solution without saying no sometimes.
Science. I think that's true. I talked a little bit earlier about consistency being really key to a scalable solution. And I think it's considering the inputs that everyone has to that overall, overarching journey that you end up getting to. And thinking about that request or that suggestion in the broader view of what it is that we're trying to get to. But ultimately, there will be some things that just don't work when global consistency or consistency anywhere in a scalable way is ultimately what we're trying to get to. There will be things that just aren't scalable. And so saying no is going to be quite an important part of that journey. And that can include feature requests, it can include, requests that different people, all different teams across different markets or business areas could request it. There's lots of different things that come with that. But I think saying no is really key. And it also comes back to that trust piece that we talked a little bit about earlier. I think always saying yes all the time doesn't necessarily build that trust because you're not being transparent and honest with either
Mm.
clients or internally. You have to have that ability to say no. and to look at doing things in a slightly different way, to be able to be honest and open with them about the fact that this probably isn't what is going to drive the best outcomes for you. Actually, if we did this instead, that's ultimately what's going to get you to where you need to be.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much for all of the sort of insights that you've been sharing today. One more question. So if there's one piece of advice that you'd give to someone, about to roll out a talent assessment solution, what would it be?
Try to make sure that what you are doing is well understood by the business, because I think that's ultimately what will lead to buy-in, and that's what's going to lead you to getting to those goals that I keep talking about. I know if it's well understood what you're doing and why you're doing it and what the outcome of that will be, so you know what that's helping to drive, whether it's efficiency or fairness or whatever it is you're trying to focus on, then that's what will enable you to get great adoption from all the different people, the different users that are in the platform every day, and will help to drive some of that data that we need to be able to then start to iterate things as we move forward.
So I guess that kind of brings us to the end of our podcast for today. Really appreciate your time, Emily, and your insights. It's been really, really interesting. I guess as a final reflection, there's been a lot to take in, and that we've learned a lot over the last the conversations that we've had with you. I guess in terms of my reflections, it feels like, with my Sova hat on, the relationships between the teams within our business are vital to good customer success. We all need to understand what our clients' goals are and how they define success. And we need to find alignment in terms of how we're going to achieve that from our different teams. So there may be times where what you're trying to achieve feels like it's in competition with what we're trying to achieve, or there's a competing priority there. But we need to be working more closely together to say, how do we get to the point where we're all pushing in the same direction and getting to that point that the client needs to get to? And it feels like the only way we can achieve that is by building good, trusting relationships and having really good communication and good conversations between the teams. I know we try to do that. We try to talk regularly, but being confident to say no to each other as well. So, this is not just about relationships with clients. It's, within the team as well. It's being comfortable saying that might not work. Let's have a think, think about a different way of trying to achieve that. So yeah, I think that would probably be my reflection on today. Caroline, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Not really. I think the comment you made, Emily, about, effectively us all having that kind of customer success ethos or mindset was really poignant for me. Like, I think it makes sense, right? That's why we're all here. We're trying to support and build the best solutions and build the best experiences and get the best outcomes for our clients. So, it's a simple thing to say, but it makes a lot of sense. And I think, everything that Nick's just said about relationships, internal and external, the trust and the transparency, I think, because I think, we'll always have, just like within a client, even within our organization, a lot of conflicting priorities. But that transparency about where you're the sort of conduit or the mouthpiece for what the client is aiming to achieve. And also our trust as a business outside the customer success team, that you will be having those kinds of nuanced conversations with clients about focus and direction and what outcomes they want. So it's already been sort of guided and supported by your team to know that when you come to the rest of the business and have challenges to solve, we know that they've effectively been thought through and objectively considered with you and the client, to know that that is something that's required and that we can all work together to achieve. So I think, the value of your team. I think every time we do this, Nick and we speak to people within our business, I learn so much. And I really see how, collectively all the different parts of our organization work well together to try and deliver the best outcomes for clients. So thank you. Thank you for everything that you shared. But yes, the time has come to close the episode. So thank you. And thanks for everybody tuning in to The Score. If you found this episode helpful, whether you're rolling out assessments or supporting talent strategies, check out our previous episodes. New episodes drop every 2 weeks on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your talent acquisition fix. Okay. Emily, you're amazing. That was so good.
No.